You want to be better at giving feedback to poets when you're reading their poems, and we're going to talk about some things that you might want to consider, and maybe it'll also help you when you're receiving feedback as well. Good morning, evening, afternoon, guys. Welcome to Diversus Live. We talk about all things poetry to guide you into this journey. There's me. Hello, my name is Jeff.
Matthias.
How are you today?
I'm fantastic. How are you, man?
I'm okay. You told me some big news. You're getting into the improv scene,
I am getting
which
into
is
that
really,
improv
really
scene.
exciting.
It's kind of exciting. I think, I think as a performer, as a like being on stage and like doing poems, I think it kind of it gives you that little bit of an entryway into like adopting a personality, like if your poems lean that way, which a lot of mine do. And so I'm really excited. We've been doing like practices. I've been doing practices for about 2 months now. So my first show is the 26th of September. And
Very
I'm really
exciting.
excited for, some big things. It's gonna be a good time.
Wait, for 2 months. How often do you meet?
We meet on most Mondays.
Okay.
So it's not every Monday, but it's like we have a group chat, and then everybody just kind of gauges, hey, like, who's all able to make it to
Yeah.
practice. And, you know, we meet up and we do some improv.
Is it ever like really bad?
I don't know. I don't. So, because I think that the thing about well, a, it's like we're practicing, so it's like it's really hard to kind of gauge like what's really good or really bad, maybe
Just
in this
yeah,
space.
you don't
I
know what the
think,
audience is going to respond.
yeah, I think the thing that I think the thing that's happening with the practices, or the thing that happens in practice, is not really gauging whether or not you have the ability to do improv, because I think that's like the reason that we're there is because we have the ability to do improv. It's really practicing so that we can kind of understand the rules and the dimensions and the dynamics of improv, because
Yeah.
like those are things that, like, even if I can do a voice and I can act and I can do some stuff, if I don't know the rules of improv and stuff like that, this, it's going to be hard to, like, fit myself into that kind of space with, all the rules that are there. So that's kind of what's happening there, and kind of sharpening those tools. So I don't think there is necessarily a good or bad, as much as, a lot a lot of the people there have been doing improv for years. They're kind of training some of the newer people. So it's just really about, kind of looking at what everybody else is doing and kind of figuring out where you kind of fit in.
Not you. Okay.
And it's been pretty cool.
Do you think it's helping your writing?
Uh, no, but I don't,
All right.
and I always, I don't. The only reason I'm saying that is because, like, I don't think that it exercises the same muscle. Actually, I'll take that back. So I'll take it back. Like, I still don't think it necessarily helps my writing, but I'm thinking probably because I'm like, the way that I write probably influences, you know, is the reason why I would maybe be a good candidate to do improv as opposed to the inverse. And that's probably because I was already writing first, you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? I don't think I've encountered, like, we've done scenarios and stuff like that, but I haven't pulled anything from scenarios,
Mm-hmm.
like, for my writing or anything like that. At least yet. Like, maybe in the future I would. I don't know, but at least yet it hasn't.
Got you. Okay. Yeah. I feel like, I mean, Columbus has a, I don't know much about it. I mean, there is a comedy scene. I imagine it's kind of like
Yeah.
the poetry scene. Like, once you're in it, you see it a lot more. Like, I feel like Columbus is
Yeah.
a lot of, for those who haven't been to Columbus, Columbus has lots of like random circles. Like, there's a big chess community, there's a poetry community, there's a comedy community, there's a music community. But like, if you
Yeah.
just visit and you don't know anyone in it, it's kind of hard to know that, oh, this is where all the events are kind of going on.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I feel like once I got into it, and I don't say that, like, because I'm not even like super big in the improv community yet. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I really want to figure out some more spaces that people are doing improv and stuff like that. But I think it's really interesting because, like, improv is kind of like the language of a lot of entertainment fields that
Mm.
are existing right now. Like, if you think about something like Wild and Out, like the show. Have you heard of Wild and Out? You know
That
Wild and Out.
one, actually, no.
You
But
know, look, yeah, Nick Cannon. I feel like that
mm,
program
not sure.
right there is like, is improv. You know what I mean? It's like a whole bunch of comedians and artists and stuff like that, and you kind of give them a premise, and like all of the same principles are there, kind of projecting outward. It's always a yes and you never just flatly say no to something, and it's like a whole bunch of stuff like that. So yeah, I think all of those things are kind of, and again with Wild and Out, like the cool thing about it, or the thing that you're able to kind of brand it, and so it doesn't really seem like, oh, like, look, you're watching improv. It's like you're watching a show, but that show is all of these artists engaging with improv.
I feel that. Okay. Cool. Well, congrats on your first show.
Yeah, thanks.
Coming up,
man.
so 26th, end of the month.
26.
Very exciting. For us, one of the things that we did over the weekend, we had our first Saturday meetup at the art museum. So we had an ekphrastic exercise. It was good. Yeah. I thought, so we have 4 free so basically what we do, we go to art museum and just do ekphrastic writing exercises and then talk about doing ekphrastic writing exercises. It's great. I thought maybe like 4, because I can do free tickets for 4 people. And those got gobbled up pretty fast, but I wasn't sure if other people would want to, spend money. Because, I mean, Saturday, the art museum has a free day on Sunday, but like I want to kind of, we're working on developing our relationship with the art museum, so it's like I wanted to bring people the day when it's not free.
Yeah.
Right. So I thought that no one else would come because we were on a day when the museum's not free. But no, there was a good, like, it was a good, we probably had about 10-ish poets there. So
Nice.
like on a Saturday, writing some art poems and things like that. I'm like, okay,
There you go.
cool. And there are other people that are interested in just the time we didn't work out. So that's something we're doing once a month. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you had one takeaway from the experience this past Saturday, what would it be?
I think more time would be helpful. Because the reality is by the time it starts at 10:30, we get people there. We wait. People are always late because we run on poet time out here. So we're not really getting started on the writing until about 10:45 ish, and it's not like a massive museum, but it's big enough. So, if we're meeting at like 11:30 just to like have a quick discussion, it's not a ton of writing time. But at the same time, a lot of people got tons and tons of ideas, and so I think it can work, but I think the time just went a little faster than I was expecting. But yeah, I was happy with it. Keep doing it once a month. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a really cool partnership too, because I think that like ekphrastic poetry is something that it's more common than maybe I might imagine.
Yeah.
People kind of give it credit for. Like, people are always writing poems based off of art and stuff that they see. So, yeah, like having something super intentional with the art museum, I think is a good strategy.
We're slowly building that relationship.
Right.
Slowly. All right, let's get into our central discussion, though, which is something that I think a lot of poets have some difficulty with. Is I think they can have difficulty receiving feedback, but I think there can be a lot of difficulty in terms of delivering feedback to people.
Yeah.
Because it takes a lot of people skills and awareness, I think, to kind of navigate that. And
True.
poets aren't necessarily always the most attuned that, ironically, I think. And so I think there's a lot of maybe we just kind of identify some problems that we want to watch out for. I think probably the biggest problem we want to avoid is ending up rewriting the poem in our own perspective. Because it's I think we're biased. We have our own ideas of what works in poetry and what doesn't. We have our own we read a poem, we read someone else's poem, we know they're expecting feedback, and we're like, oh, well, you could do this, and then like if they followed all those directions, be like, well, this poem sounds remarkably like your voice instead of
Yeah,
mine, you know.
yeah.
So I think that's a kind of a first big concern that I would say.
Yeah, I, definitely when like in giving like critiques or anything like that, I think again it takes you having to you have to examine yourself as an artist and a I don't know, somebody that does give critiques or something like that, because I think it's like you I don't know. There's another thing that maybe that will be, which will be another point later on down the line, so I won't spoil it. But I think a lot of artists, they view how they think about their art or how they think about poetry in general as like, this is the way that you should be thinking about poetry, and so they, when they engage with other people's work, their rubric for what's wrong with it is whether or not they would write it like that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a tendency to try to do something like that, or to see an idea and be like, man, it would just be so great if you just did my idea instead. And so, yeah, just try to resist that urge.
Which is hard because I think a lot of times I don't think anyone's necessarily doing that intentionally,
Yeah.
but it's also trying to understand when it's happening so you can kind of back off. So like, are there any strategies that you kind of employ to make sure that doesn't happen?
Uh, so I what I typically do, so it kind of depends. And so like, I think that there are spaces that I don't want to say that I would absolutely. I think that's a so. I would say, for example, I was working on. I think we talked about this before. Button Poetry had a poetry video contest, and for the poetry video contest, I was essentially reaching out to people that I know, like performers that I know, to say, hey, if you want to submit something to the poetry video contest, you know, I can shoot and direct a video for you. But like, because I also am a poet, and like I'm, you know, I don't consider myself to be like some kind of great amazing poet, but I've seen a lot of poems, and I'm like, okay, like, let me try to get feedback. I think there was like one poem that I was like, this is, I hear the heart of this poem, and also like the person that wrote the poem, I think they kind of like wrote it like that day, you know what I mean? And I'm like, okay, like, it's cool, but I think that there's some things that we can do to kind of give us the best chance possible to get a win here. You know what I mean? And I think in that space, because it wasn't necessarily about the work as much as it was like, we want to present something that we think Button is going to choose. You know what I mean? And I think that's the way that I kind of maneuvered that space. I was like, hey, this isn't about, because like, if we wanted to talk about the quality of the work or what to do with the poem or anything like that, maybe we're sitting down having a different conversation. But because we're sitting down and we have a recording session that's happening right now, we have to do something different, which is like, we have to decide like, okay, like, what is it that we think is going to be the best, give us the best chance. And then later on down the line, if you're like, well, I want to figure something else out with this poem, I'm like, yeah, we should, but you know, for these purposes. Outside of that, when it just comes to just regular writing workshops, I know this is gonna sound kind of like callous maybe, but I try to put into my mind like, at the end of the day, how much does this mean to me? And like, I try, and I know that like, I think that's like a, again, I don't want it to be like super, I don't want it to feel like super callous, but I think in the past, it's definitely easy to, it can be easy to get really, really, really invested with your view and critique of any kind of artwork. And so to the point where it's like, even, listen, I've been talking about people's work to them, and I realize like, what am I doing? Like, I'm not, as soon as I'm done with this space, this person, even if they're wrong, they're right. You know what I mean? Like, even if I'm like, this doesn't make any sense, I'm trying to tell you like, this doesn't, like, you're not doing what you think you're doing. I'm like, they're right, because it's their work, it's their art. Whatever they do with it or don't do with it, it's going to be up to them.
Right.
So I'm like, yeah, well, if at the end of the day, whatever happens with this work is going to be up to this person, then, hey, I'm not about to. All right, fine, fair enough. If you think this is the way the poem should go, then man, this is the way the poem should go. And I think that helps me kind of temper like how much I'm willing to kind of go down the rabbit hole. Am I really willing to rebut this person a third time or a fourth time about something that I'm like, yeah, I mean, okay, fair enough. A lot of times I just tap out. I'm just like, all right, fair enough. You got it. What about you?
I feel that. I think something earlier you mentioned just about, you mentioned how submitting for button, you're like, okay, this is what button's kind of looking for. So I think when I'm giving feedback to people, one of the first things I try to ask is, what's your goal for the poem? Because that directly determines the type of feedback I'm going to give you. Because if you're
Yeah.
like, this poem's for me, I went through something I just want to put on paper, I'm not going to give you the same feedback as if you're like, I am aiming for, Poetry Mag, or I'm aiming for, like Kenyan Review, because I can, that completely changes the amount of feedback and the type of feedback I'm going to give you.
Yeah.
So, or it could be that, oh, I'm preparing this for slam. That also greatly changes the feedback I'm going to be giving. So I think the first thing I really need to understand as someone that's going to be giving feedback to you on something is, I need to understand what is the purpose you have for the piece,
Yeah.
because there is no one size fits all. You know, like, I think a lot of the techniques that might work great on the page are not going to work if you're planning on performing it necessarily. You know,
Yeah.
so that's probably the first thing that I try to understand. And then another question that I like to ask first before I get feedback is, so again, the first question is, what's the goal for the poem, and then the second question I ask is like, who is the poem for? Because again, if the poem's for you, well then, in a lot of ways, that kind of can shut down the whole feedback session immediately. Because no matter what, you're you best. I can't do that for you. But if you're like, you know what, this is for, I'm aiming for, a more academic crowd, or I'm aiming for, a more performance crowd, or I'm aiming for an academic performance crowd, or I'm aiming for, whatever.
Yeah.
All of these things, again, also dictate a lot of the choices as well. And the more specific you can be, like, oh, I'm aiming, for like 40-year-old, you know, 40-year-old like moms. Well, okay, well, that's gonna change that. What's very different than you're aiming for like 4-year-old kids? Like, it's like, if you're writing children's poems, it's a whole different thing. Like, it changes your word choice. It changes the subject matter potentially. It changes a lot. And so I'm trying to put myself into the best position to give you the feedback that you need. And I think if I don't have an understanding of those concepts, it's hard for me to give the feedback that's going to be the most salient to what you need.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's hard because I think a lot of poets aren't thinking those terms. I think a lot of poets are thinking, I wrote a poem and I want feedback on my poem.
Okay, so I'll say this. I think that a lot of the time there's a lot of issues that happen when two people or two or more people are kind of engaged in that practice of, here's my poem, and then the other person saying, here's your poem, and let's talk about it. And one of them is, I think a lot of poets are going, okay, let's like kind of think about like what's happening with poets, right? Like a lot of poets, by the time they're people that go to an open mic, they represent one out of 100 people that they would know that would ever public speak ever. You know what I mean? So it's like, a lot of poets don't know anybody else that would ever public speak, or maybe very few people that would public speak, and maybe fewer people that would public speak extemporaneously. Fewer people than that would public speak their own work that they've created and put it up for people's like thoughts and opinions and things like that. And a lot of people, by the time they get it to you, like they've gotten a whole bunch of commendation and you're great. Oh my gosh, you're such a great writer. You're all this other stuff. So a lot of times they're putting it in front of you to hear more of that, right? They're putting it in front of you so that they can say, like, the thing that they're expecting is for you to be as awestruck and amazed at their talent and their prose as their cousins and their nieces and all these other people. And I think that's like a really important thing to kind of acknowledge or to try to fish out before sitting down to critique somebody's work. Because if that is that person, if that person is like you know, I just need to hear how good my work is, and if you're about to say how negative or whatever my work is, I stop altogether. You know what I mean? Because I'm actually not gonna at an open mic. I might, because unless you're asking me at an open mic, oh, actually I take that back. Unless if you're one of the people in my like inner circle as community, you know what I mean? Then we talk about each other's work all the time. You know what I mean?
Behind our backs.
In group chats, just separately, I'm just like, this. Can you believe that? But yeah, no. But outside of that, like if it's just somebody generally at an open mic and they do a poem, I might not say anything negative or be like, this is a critique or anything. I probably won't. You know, I if I remember their poem, you know what I mean? I'll probably try to give something positive and be like, yo, I know that was good. You know what I'm saying? Whatever. And then again, for people that are in that circle, or like, like people that we're close, these are people that I would, maybe later on or even in that space be like, hey, I like what you did here. I'm wondering, was this about you? Can I see that on paper? Stuff like that. And so, but yeah, I just think that there's some people that when you're getting into a space, and so now you have an intentional space that is for critiquing work, that is for doing that. Once you're in that space, I'm like, I can either do this freely or I can't. But I'm not gonna do the thing. You know what I mean? Like I'm not gonna do like the first half of it. I think if there's positive things, if you're in the critique space, then you should be able to sit down and engage with some of the things that are like, oh, this is like I off mission with your poem, and like there's things that I'm like are really important for you to say in this poem that you're not saying in this poem, or for you not to say in this poem that you are saying in the poem. And I think that it's it's one of those things that like once you're in that critiquing space, it's like you have to be able to absorb. You know what I mean? And you have to be able to kind of do that so you can engage with that in one space, but you have to be able to absorb in another space. So I try to flesh that out. Like once we're in the space, I assume everybody is on that. But as soon as I see that somebody's not on it, as soon as I see like, yeah, like like they're not willing to or have an openness to engage with anything, any kind of critique, then I don't do the positive thing either. I'm like, okay, because I don't want to reinforce something that I'm in a space to also try to deconstruct or help deconstruct if possible.
I think one workshop technique. So if I'm leading a workshop, one technique that I like that can avoid kind of that like, oh, just give me like, I'm just looking like fishing for compliments. One thing I like is we talked about this before. There's different workshop styles. There's probably the most common is the Iowa model, where if you're being workshopped, you sit silently while the people around you who are looking at your poem kind of discuss you, and then at the end you can raise questions and things like that. There's reasons I like that model, but the model that I do like, it's called like the courtroom model, which is basically I think a way that gives a lot more agency onto the poet, and it forces them to decide what the direction that they want the conversation to go in. So, for instance, if they want it to be like the compliment thing, all right, fine, we'll tell you all about the things we think are working. But it also allows them a chance, I think, to see what the critiques are and then choose to whether or not they want to go deep. So basically, the way it works is that you read the poem, and then everyone needs to write down two or three comments. They can be praise, they can be questions, they could be suggestions, all that. And basically, everyone needs to write two or three, and then you hand them over to the poet you're reviewing, and the poet whose work is being reviewed, they decide like, oh, I want us to discuss this question. I don't want us to discuss this one. So like they have complete control over the types of feedback that they give. And when a topic is raised, something I think is really valuable is that then the whole group has to either agree or disagree. It's almost like voting. Do like, okay, so someone says that the rhyme scheme is distracting for this poem. Okay, and then like you get all in favor, like raise your hand, and then everyone who's not, they can keep their hand down. So you can kind of get a general gauge, like, is this piece of feedback something that everyone agrees with? Because that can be hard in a lot of workshop sessions. It's like someone makes a point, but you have no idea if everyone else is feeling the same thing. Whereas this is a way to kind of gauge, like, is there a general consensus or is that just an outlier comment? So I'm going to take it with a grain of salt, So I like that aspect of it. And then if the poet's like, okay, we see the vote, I want to talk more about this, or like, oh, I see the vote. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Like it gives so much more agency to the poet, which I really like. The other thing I was going to say was I completely forget, but it'll come back to me in a moment. I think again, like giving the poet the ability to control the type of feedback that they're genuinely looking for, I think, is a way to demonstrate respect for the poet, regardless of how you feel about it. Because I think it's very easy for these sorts of discussions to. I think it's easy for them to turn negative, and I think it's easy for them to turn into things that maybe the poet doesn't want to get into.
I think one of the things that's important about that though is that like let's say I think that there's some spaces where that poet will be able to engage in a constructive criticism space on other people's work. You know what I mean? They can grasp the thought that, they don't have any kind of negative intentions with, giving this criticism. This is what they think about the work. But again, if once their work is being examined and we're talking about their work, they're not able to, it's impossible to absorb. I'll never forget, when it was, I think I was like, this is my second year doing doing poetry as far as like performing and doing features and stuff like that. But like we went out of town. We went to Flint actually, and we had a show, and then we had a workshop first, and then we had a show. And during the workshop, I remember like it was interesting because it was like there was this girl that was engaging with the entirety of the workshop where people were talking about their poems and they were like, this is that. And I wouldn't say she's the most vocal, but she was one of the most vocal as far as like, this is what I think about this poem. This is why this is that and the third and all this other stuff. And you would think that she's put a lot of work into her poems. And I'm not saying that she didn't. But I'm saying that when she did her poems, it was like, oh, it was clear, like, okay, there's some things that we could probably talk about with your poem. And it was so interesting that like she was just, as soon as people like we did the same mechanism for everybody. People talked about their poem, and then or people read their poem, and everybody had a sheet of their poem, and then people just kind of went around. It wasn't super formal, but everybody just kind of went around and talked about like what they liked and what they thought they had questions on, or they actually intentionally asked like questions like, hey, what is this, what do you mean by this, or what does this kind of entail, or what made you go with this certain thing. And when we got to her poem, it was like, no, we're not doing that. Yeah, this is just my personal poem. And all this, like, you did make you made 20 copies of your personal poem that you were like, hey, this is just my personal poem. Like, you just wouldn't get it. Right. You wouldn't understand. Yeah, the reason why you don't get it is just because you wouldn't understand. The reason why that doesn't make sense to you is because you don't understand. Right. And it was like, I see what's happening here. I see that, like, right. it's very easy to critique things. And again, I think that was a situation where it was like there was an expectation that, again, and we can any one of us can be guilty of it, but it's like if we represent somebody who, again, typically if you're a poet performing on stage, you probably at some point in your education, a teacher probably said, "Wow, you're a good poem. You're a good poet." I don't know if your teacher called you a good poem, but like you're a good poet. You write really well, and like like they kind of giving that encouragement, or somebody somewhere is kind of giving you that encouragement. And I think a lot of people kind of take that to mean like, oh, I'm some kind of once in a lifetime, prodigal uh, speaker of my generation. Yeah. And so now it's like we're sitting around a table and they're thinking that I'm, everybody's bringing their poems, but I'm just a better poet than everybody. That's, so by the time they get to my poem, there should be nothing to say. So now when there's stuff to say, it's like you can see her getting uneasy when people are just writing on the piece of paper. She was like, what's going on? Y'all don't see how amazing this work is? So yeah, it's just, I think, again, I think there's something to that, but I just think it's really important in those workspaces, because I think that if you're in a space where you're allowed to be as tough and insistent with critiques as you want to, but you disallow people to even crack into your poem, then I'm like, okay, I don't think this is the space I even want to. I don't want to do half of it. I want to make sure that, hey, if this is what you want, it's what you want. And I also think that like because there's real value there. There's real value in people working on your poems and workshopping your poems with you. And I just don't want to mess up that process by making you think that your poems are above critique.
Mm-hmm. I do think that also speaks to, though, there is, I think, a social proof element to this as well, like in the terms of who you receive feedback from. Because like if you it's one thing to receive feedback from someone, but then like you see their own work, I feel like that gives you a sense of like, yes, I want to receive feedback from this person, or no, I actually don't really want, or I can't really, I'll hear them out, but I'm not going to take what they tell me very seriously, you know. And I think that's one of the values that you get from attending workshops like Cave and like Kalu, where it's like people have been vetted to a degree, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think there's that sense that I can trust the level of feedback that I'm going to get from my peers.
100%.
I think another thing that I found in terms of when I'm giving feedback is, and we talked about this before, like I just really don't see like good writing and bad writing. It's all about what's happening in the piece itself. What were the opportunities that were chosen? What are the opportunities that are still on the table? And what are the things that can amplify the direction that the poem wants to go in? And I find with that sort of mindset, there really isn't a good or a bad. It's like, is this poem achieving the goal it intends, or is it not? And if it's not achieving the goals, then how can you're turning to me for guidance, how can I help you bring that poem closer to its goals? Because I think, and I didn't always view it this way, but I think a lot of times if you view poems as like good and bad, you start kind of, you fall into this trap of like, you're like, I think you see this a lot at workshops. What's the piece of feedback that people give when they don't know what other feedback to give on a piece?
The piece of feedback they give.
It's like you're reading a poem. Imagine like you're in a room. Poets are reading a poem for workshop. Sometimes you read a poem for workshop and you're like, I have no idea what I'm going to say for feedback. I've seen people go through that. And so the feedback that I see people commonly give in that sort of situation is things like, I love the imagery. I love that image. I find that that sort of comment is one of the most common, or like, I love that line. Like I think I
Okay.
think I
Like
love that
like
image. I love that line. Like I feel like those are the sorts of comments that you get when people aren't entirely sure what else to give you a lot. I think those are kind of like fallbacks, because
uh
it can be
that's fair.
relatively. I
I think that's fair.
I think if we look at like levels of feedback, I feel like that's one of like the lowest levels of feedback.
I get that
You
too.
can find something to be like, oh, that was an interesting image,
Yeah.
and in some ways it's almost the cheapest feedback, because it's like it doesn't actually give you a lot that's meaningful, because a lot of times people just end it there. They won't even tell you why they like it.
Yeah.
They won't even tell you about, oh, this is really enhancing the structure, oh, this is in parallel with another element that appeared earlier. It's a way to get in, say something, feel like you contributed, and get out.
Yeah.
It's very
Yeah.
non-committal, right? Whereas or the other thing that you see a lot is like, oh, like, this wasn't bad, or the more common thing is like, oh, we need to cut, and I've been guilty of this too. I find that nowadays I'm fine with cutting, but I also want to understand before I cut, or before I give a suggestion to cut. I really want to understand why something is there, because it was, you originally wrote it there for a reason, and maybe that reason is just not being explored enough yet, or
Yeah.
maybe like we haven't fully teased out what it's serving. And if you cut it, you might lose that element of it. I think we've all had moments where we cut a poem to the extent that we almost kind of, you lose the heart of it.
Yeah.
So it's like, I really want to understand before giving that sort of suggestion, because that's a major. I mean, you wouldn't just like, if you're doing brain surgery, you can't just like keep cutting away at the brain. Like eventually you're going to cause problems. Like you got to keep something.
That's what went wrong.
Like,
It's all coming together.
So it's like, before you do it, you want to just really understand what's the purpose of the thing, and
Yeah.
then decide, are there other things that if we remove this, we're not losing anything?
I think that's one of the things that it's good to know, because later on, the writer is going to be fighting for things that you don't fully understand why they're fighting for it. You know what I mean? So it's like, and not even necessarily fighting for it, and that like they're like, it's between you and them. Like whoever, whichever one of y'all wins gets their way, because it's like that person gets their way regardless of how this conversation goes. But it's really about, like, sometimes, like, looking at somebody's poems, whereas like I think that I have, are we,
I think it was just a camera. Go on.
oh,
Sorry.
there we go. Well, I think I have a really good grasp of what the writer was thinking and doing here, and so my being like, well, let's just take this line out. Like, I don't think that, like, to them that line means something that maybe I'm not seeing yet, and maybe me understanding that will still result in me recommending to take it out, but I can explain, like, oh, I understand
Right.
why you have that in here, and I get it, but I think that you're also communicating that here, and you're doing it
Right.
stronger here, and if you're doing it stronger here, you don't want to do it weaker somewhere
Yeah.
else, you know what I mean? So it's like small things like that. Like I would much rather be able, I any kind of critique, in my opinion, should start with a question or multiple questions. Should start with, why is this here? Who are you referring to? What is this poem? What is this doing for the poem? What is this doing for you? Like, anything,
Right.
that way you can kind of understand what's going on. And then once you've been able to wrap your head around that, it's like, okay, and then we can kind of go in with the scalpel, I guess. We can kind of go in with the scalpel and kind of be like, okay, well, let's see what we can kind of peel apart here.
Yeah. Because it was written there for a reason. You know, might not even be a good reason, but it was there for a reason. Because lines don't just appear by themselves. So like there was a thought process that went into it. And the better I can understand that thought process, the better sort of feedback I can give.
a lot of times people, you know what's so funny, man? I absolutely used to do this when I first started performing. And shout out to JG and Janelle. They're somewhere out there, and they know this to be true. When I first started writing, like they were like, well, when I first started like performing, JG was like, "You're a good writer, but for the for the sake of me, I had no idea why your poems were so long." Because I used to have this notebook, right, and the notebook was about this big, and I don't know why. I don't know what made me think this, but I was like, all of my poems have to be 4 pages long. And I not typed. I'm writing them by hand, 4 pages long. Now I don't know if you understand how like my handwriting was is pretty solid, so it's right there in the margins, not all over the place, not super large. For and like I think that if you were to tell me then that like, hey, I think 55% of this poem is just you
Trying to hit that page count.
trying to hit that page count, then I'd be like, no, of course it's not. And I would defend every single line to you. Oh my God. Oh, like I could tell you some of the poems that exist right now that are much better incarnations of those poems. That then out Kobe used to be a much longer poem. Dinner, much longer poem. Like a lot of these poems are like they used to be huge, and I would defend them for hours until finally I'm like, yeah, let me just experiment with it. I'm like, dang, like I was when I cut it, it became a stronger piece, and so I think that's what happens a lot of times with poets. A lot of times poets are like they want, you know what's so funny? Okay, so and I don't know how the what am I want to make sure I'm saying this like
I'll just go at it. Say,
I don't know how the Black
apologies.
Poetry Show community feels about this article. But Scott Woods, he actually dropped an article. It says we like the rewind must end, or we must get rid of the rewind, or something like that. And you know something like there's parts of that I agree with, but it's also like it's almost like saying you have to we have to stop yelling at the killers when we when we see them on the movie screen at the movies. It's like, should that stop? Good decorum asks you to, but will that stop? I don't think so.
I think it depends on the intention of your show.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because I feel like at a show like The Nest, it's like, and again, this is kind of like, I think this can damage the writer more than the performer, because that rewind, some poets are writing for the rewind. They're writing in these little punchy lines, and these punchy lines are supposed to get that reaction from the audience, and and I've seen it. Like I've seen poets say a line that they were like, that line's gonna hit, and they said it, and nobody said rewind, and so they just say, well, I'm gonna rewind my dang self, and then I'm okay. Listen, regardless of what you feel about the rewind, I don't.
That is like
regardless of what you say about the rewind,
no one.
Do not rewind yourself. Whoever it is that is under the sound of my voice, please, if nobody has said rewind, nobody has said that, do not say, oh, y'all must not be listening, I'm going to rewind myself. I said, and then do it again. I'm telling you. Oh, wow. But it's like, but
I've not witnessed that. That's why.
Oh man, nah, Jeff, I've been to some spaces, man. I'm not gonna name the city because it was not Columbus. I'm not gonna name the city because if I name the city, then if you watch this, you'll know it was you, and I don't want that. I don't want that to be.
Y'all done heard me.
It's like, we were at a show. We went. Me and JG went out of town for a show, right? And like it was an open mic. And what you have to know is that like JG had a nationally recognized poetry album. He has a nationally recognized poetry album. He has a really big catalog of poems, and he has a really great CV. Like he has an Emmy, which he does not say enough.
He doesn't carry around enough.
He doesn't. He doesn't.
That thing would be attached to my
That's
hand.
why I'm saying it would. It would.
It would be right
part
here.
of like we. It would be right like and everything. But it's so funny because it was like so people I think are like when they were it'd be so funny because I don't know if JG can clock it, and maybe if he's watching this like he would comment at some point in the future, but I don't know if he could clock it. But when we'd be out places, people are like performing so they could be like, oh JG, like look how good I am, and I'm like, okay, cool. But it would be like you'd be watching them do the poem and like they're upset at the audience for not locking in with what they're saying. And so they're getting at the audience, I said ba 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 ba, and then like you can kind of feel when at the end of their line they're like kind of looking at they say their line, their poem's not done. So it's not like they're pausing because the poem's done, and they're just pausing because they just said something slick, and now they're looking at y'all like, yeah. And even if people are saying a little, they're looking for the rewind. They're like, the rewind is like the ultimate crowning achievement. Like, oh yeah, I'll do it. I'll go ahead and say it again. And it's also like a thing to stay on stage for longer. You know what I mean? So there's all types of things that go with the rewind, but ultimately it's like rewind is like you know that you're really doing it. And I feel like, again, regardless of what you feel about it, if somebody is not saying rewind to you, do not.
You should thank them, actually. You should literally thank them for not.
For not saying thank you?
Yeah. No, you should thank them for not saying rewind. That's
for not saying rewind. Listen, again, it depends on if the poetry culture at your show is a rewind your poem type venue and stuff like that. Like I don't personally have a problem with it. I read the article. I'm like I do get it, but I'm like I think that there is a subsection of artists and poets that are writing their poems with the rewind kind of embedded. I don't necessarily, think that's always super great, but I get it.
It's a hard spot to be in because, you write a poem, I think even when poets say that they wrote this poem just for themselves, but then they're showing it in some way. Like if you truly wrote a poem just for yourself, I wouldn't even know that you have that poem. I think a lot of times.
I don't want to hear it.
Like it's not that I don't want to. It's not that I don't want to hear it, but like if it's really for you, like the fact that you share it with other people suggests to me that you're not entirely content with it just being for you.
I agree with that. I think that you've put it in a space where people are absorbing it, and that's the thing. I think that it's like if somebody is saying that this is a personal poem, but people praise it, they don't revert to it's a personal poem.
It's a defense mechanism.
You know what I mean?
It's purely a defense because it's like so that way I can. If you reject me, well, you can't reject me because this poem's for me. But if you praise me, well, yeah, now it's our poem.
It's our poem.
So
I did a great job.
Look, I mean, I get it. Psychologically, we have all kinds of defenses we put into place to, preserve ourselves. I get that, but I think, writing. If you find yourself writing for the rewind, from an outside perspective, that. I don't want to say like that, like I feel pity, but it's like, man, like you're not in a position where you're not willing to stand on your own, because you're looking for that external validation for what you're doing. And I hope that at some point with your writing, you can arrive at a position where you have a piece that even if there's a chance you're not going to get the audience reaction that you want, that you still feel comfortable sharing the piece.
Yeah, I think that there's there's another side to that too, because I know plenty of people that make like their career is poetry. You know, whether or not they are able to book a show and do this or do that with poetry over the next couple months is like the deciding factor whether or not they pay their bills. And so the way that they maneuver and the way that they write and the way that they conduct themselves like is all kind of based in that. And I know plenty of those guys who maybe you wouldn't say are right because maybe not all their poems aren't this singular way. You know what I mean? So it's like, and they're skilled and they're skilled writers. But there are some of their poems that are like, you know, built with that kind of punchliney. You just heard that. Everybody thought that was super witty. They're gonna ask you for a rewind and stuff like that. I even give a good example from my own. Like I feel like, in a lot of ways, the Jesus versus Satan battle rap poem is like built. It's like a punchliney poem that is built. The way that it's built and the way that it's constructed is so that somebody can say rewind anywhere in that poem at the end of that punchline, and I can say the punchline, and I can.
But it's also
conduct the rest of the poem.
Playing with the form of battle rap. So I mean, it's kind of
right. Which is, but I'm saying, but it's still, and again, which is to say, like but it's still a poem, right? So it's like that poem because it's doing something in specific. It's like it's built in with this thought that like the crowd can react in maybe a similar way that a battle rap audience might react, which is kind of giving you energy, telling you to say that again and stuff like that. Which I think that there's other occasions to do that. You know what I mean? Like with other people's work.
That's a lot to talk about for rewinds. We gave them more time than they deserve. But
rewind, run that back. I'm gonna start to run that back open mic, and the running back open mic is just after every stanza you have to say the stanza.
No, I mean it's gotta be the opposite.
You gotta say that stanza again louder.
No, we gotta do the fast forward. Like get off the stage. You done? You
should do like a. You should do like somebody should do like a skip the next stanza. Like you know what I'm saying? That stanza was so bad. Just skip the next stanza. Just go to your next. Go to the stanza after that.
I mean, if we can rewind, we can fast forward. I mean, fuck, we can do that. We can do that.
You might get some fights.
Worth it. How would you feel about getting fast forwarded at your own?
This poem is about a recent heartbreak that I went through.
Man, fast forward. From the back.
It'd be your ex. Fast forward. I don't want to hear that. And I just want to say sorry to my family that I really disappointed you. And this is the poem that I'm apologizing. Fast forward. We've already disowned you. Fast forward.
It's like it's not a boo. It's not a boo. Man. It's somebody's just like worse because it's like, all right, don't like do the whole. Like, don't skip the entire poem, but just like...
It's way worse than a boo. Because the reason why it's way worse than a boo is because it's like, it's more disrespectful. The entire structure of the open mic is that you got to, like, you get to read your poem on stage. So even if somebody boos, you still get to read your poem. Meaning somebody says something, you still get to read the poem. But if somebody says, I don't want to hear that. Like, your poem is so... I want this poem to be over.
But not completely.
I'm not going to stop you entirely. Just get to the point. So you're going through a really dark time in your life and things were really grim for you. Can we get... It's a little down. It's a little bit of a downer.
That could be a poetry, or it's like someone reads a poem and it's like the judges have two buttons. They can either rewind or they can fast forward.
That's gonna be the shortest lived. That's gonna be the shortest lived poetry open mic that I'll ever absolutely go to.
I think there's like a
No, don't do it. I
Too
think
late.
there should be like a clause where like I can like you can see like like Pinky in the Brain, like you could see like the scheme coming up and you're like, yeah, I'm gonna say no to that before we take over the world.
I
We're gonna
got
say
it.
like don't
It's
do
a shot.
that.
All we need like buttons. We need a couple judges. We need like a red button and a green button, and like
Somebody
and then
stop
like
it.
a display that shows like fast forward and like
There's
then
gonna
you
be
guys,
like a portal that opens up behind us.
Yeah.
It's gonna be like us from the past
I
or
think
us
it'd be
from the
really
future, and it's like this. Stop this idea now.
no. And then it would be like all right. So like if it's fast forward, you have to move ahead a line, and if it's rewind, then you have to go back a line. I think it could be. All right. Anyways, I know it's getting late. You could probably tell as well. If you're watching this. One
Oh
other
my
thing that I think
gosh.
would be really helpful when you're giving poetry feedback when workshopping, besides these buttons, would be I think, and I was talking with in a different context. So I teach, and I was talking to my students about this. So we were doing a technique called shadowing. We were listening to people talk, and then we were kind of discussing just things that we noticed about their speech. And one of the things that the students said, like, oh, they sound really emotional, and it's like, so there's different types of statements you can make, right? There's like, I feel like there's statements you make that are evaluative, like in a subjective way, and then there's like the objective statements, and it's like saying that, oh, this person when they talked they sounded emotional. Well, that's you're placing an evaluation onto that. You see it and you're being like, I judge this to be emotional,
Right.
but you're not exactly explaining how. Okay, it goes back to the thing we talked about earlier, like, oh, that's a good line. You're not actually saying anything. You're not really talking about why that's work or anything like that. So trying to stray away from the statements like good, bad, I like this, but instead leaning into the practical and the objective
Yeah.
to be like, so instead of saying like this poem confuses me, you're saying things like, I don't understand, the stakes aren't immediately clear. I don't understand the motivations for the speaker as to why they would perform or behave this way. I don't understand the connection between these two statements. The logic's not making sense. In this sentence you say this, and the next line you say that's something that's complete opposite. Something's not, the math's not mathing. The more practical you can be and the more objective you can be, the more helpful the feedback can be.
Yeah. And there's also something to I think what a lot of people do is they have like a script of what feedback to kind of give in spaces, and so even if because they can't find something else to say, they'll say that, you know what I mean, or they'll use it at least once or something like that. And I think check check.
Yeah, we're good.
Oh, we're back.
We're back. Sorry for.
I can't remember where I was. But oh yeah, I was just like, there's a lot of reasons why that's not constructive, but it's also, I think it's not constructive for you, because I think listening to people's poems and giving critiques and things like that, as much as it's helpful to the person receiving it, I think it also, in the same way that like I think talking to yourself and like thinking out loud can kind of help you figure things out that you're thinking that maybe kind of in the subconscious, but you're able to talk about it and bring it out of the subconscious. It's like that's the same thing for giving poems critiques. So it's like I'm listening to I read somebody's poem, and maybe this poet is not the same type of writer or anything that I am, but I'm able to identify like, man, like, this poet is really really general in their language around like love, and so they're using kind of maybe some cliche terms around what love is, so cliche that I can't even discern what kind of love that this relationship that they're talking about. And so now you can kind of like you voice that. Now you're like listening and you voice that and you put that out there. So now when you're engaging with your own work, you're like, man, like there's things that and maybe the reason that the other artist did it is because they have such a deep understanding of their love with that person that they haven't expressed it, and they haven't, there's subtext, like, you know what I mean, like you don't have to say like uh like 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 my wife, like I don't have to say you are my wife, that's why I love you. I say I love you to my wife and my wife knows like I love you as like her husband, right? But like if me and her are like, if I'm writing a poem and I'm like writing maybe like a I love you poem, like a, or something like that, it's like, if, and especially if it's for the consumption of the rest of the world in some kind of way or something like that, then it also falls upon me to be like, okay, well, let me express, I have to show what the relationship is, maybe not saying it directly, but maybe there's a way for me to express it so that they're able to understand what I'm saying and I'm able to make it clear. And maybe that artist isn't doing that the clearest, and I'm able to understand like, oh, that's what I don't like about this poem. And because it's like that's what I don't like about that poem, I can analyze my own work the same way. And so yeah, it's, I think, again, I think giving poems critiques and kind of working on people's poems, it can be just as helpful to yourself, if not more so, than even them.
No, I think the most valuable time of a workshop is when your poem is not being workshopped. Honestly, I think when your own poem is workshopped, I think that's the least valuable time. I think a lot of times very often the feedback that you give to other people is also the feedback that you need to hear for yourself. So like start noticing what sorts of comments you're making on other people's work, and then seeing if it applies to your own.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are just some things that I think you want to be considering if you're interested in giving feedback on other people's poems to them. It's a tricky kind of relationship. It takes a lot of faith and trust from both parties to even be involved in that, but it's also necessary, I think, if your goal is really to become a better poet, at some point you're going to have to engage in this, I think.
For sure.
Final things?
I don't know. I mean, I think as far as like the topic is concerned, I just think being open to critique, and then being open to critique of your critique. Because I think a lot of times it's like we think that because we're the ones in position to be critiquing work, that we can't be wrong about something. You know what I mean? So that's the reason why a lot of times we get defensive. And so just try to keep that line of communication open and as subjective as art is. You know what I mean? Like, don't try to make it like, because this is what I think about your poem, that this is what your poem is or means. So yeah.
Fair. Yeah. If you're in the Columbus area, just some reminders about things we got going on. Tomorrow on the channel, maybe a little bit later, I think closer to 9 tomorrow, just to note, we have Lo-Fi Poet, listen to beats and writing some poems. Yeah. Thursday afternoon, we're doing free headshots in downtown Columbus.
Oh, yeah.
And then the evening, we have a workshop. We're going to be talking about YouTube, so starting a YouTube channel around art, writing, and things like that. The space is very limited. I have 3 spots left, so if you're interested in that, please let me know. And then Friday, we have our poetry show at Third Way Cafe.
Third Way.
All right, with that, we'll let you guys go. Thanks so much for hanging with us. We'll see you next week on Diversus Live. Once more, my name is Jeff.
I'm Matthias.
We'll see you guys later. Hope you guys have a good day, a good night, and a good afternoon, you guys.